What if everything you learned about Christopher Columbus was missing the most important part? Not the ships, not the year, not even the destination. I'm talking about who he was actually looking for. Because here's what your history teacher never told you. Columbus didn't just stumble across a new world by accident. He was on a mission, a specific mission, with a specific target. And the evidence for that mission, written in his own hand, has been sitting in archives for over 500 years. Here's the setup in 30 seconds. Stay with me because this gets wild. In 1492, three massive things happened in the same year, not close to the same year, the exact same year. Moors were expelled from Spain, Jewish people were expelled from Spain, and Columbus set sail, all under orders from the same queen, Queen Isabella of Castile. That's not a coincidence, that's a pattern, and once you see what connects all three, you cannot unsee it. Drop a question in the comments right now. Do you think those three events in 1492 were connected or just bad timing? Because historians are still fighting over this. Let's go back to the beginning. 700 years. That is how long a civilization called the Moors ruled the Iberian Peninsula, the land we now call Spain and Portugal. From 711 AD to 1492 AD. 700 years of libraries, universities, hospitals, and agricultural systems so advanced that Europeans were still trying to copy their irrigation methods 2 centuries after they were gone. Most people in America have heard the word Moors, but here's what almost nobody talks about: who these people actually were, where they came from, what their records say about themselves. Because when you go back to the actual documents, the Arab chronicles, the North African genealogies, the linguistic records, a picture emerges that mainstream history has almost entirely ignored. And that picture points east, all the way back to the ancient Levant, to the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, before you click away, I'm not asking you to take anyone's word for it. We're going to follow the documents, primary sources, named historians, dated manuscripts. That's it. You decide what to make of it. Here is your first piece of evidence, and it comes from the Moors themselves. When Arab historians and geographers of the medieval period documented the peoples of North Africa and the Maghreb, the region that gave birth to the Moorish civilization, they consistently recorded something unusual. Many of the Berber tribal groups inhabiting this region carried names, clan titles, and lineage designations that were strikingly, unmistakably Hebrew in origin. The historian and sociologist Ibn Khaldun, writing in 1377 in his monumental work called the Muqaddimah, arguably the most important work of historical sociology ever produced in the Arabic language, recorded multiple Berber tribal confederations that identified themselves as descendants of the Canaanites and the ancient Israelites who fled westward across North Africa long before the rise of Islam. Ibn Khaldun didn't speculate. He documented what Berber people told him about their own origins. He recorded names of clans, he recorded migration routes, and he noted explicitly that certain Berber groups traced their ancestry to the sons of Canaan and to what he described as the Hebrew peoples who moved west following the destruction of their homeland. Now stop, think about that for a second. This is not a conspiracy theorist on the internet. This is the 14th century's most respected Arab historian, writing in Arabic, documenting what North African people said about themselves. The question is, why did they say that? What would make an entire civilization claim Hebrew ancestry? To understand that, you have to go back to 70 AD. In 70 AD, the Roman general Titus destroyed Jerusalem. The Second Temple was burned, and according to ancient sources, including Josephus, the first-century Romano-Jewish historian, over 1 million people were killed, and hundreds of thousands more were scattered or enslaved. But here's what most people don't know. Not everyone who fled went north into Europe or east into Babylon. Some went south and west, into Egypt, into Libya, into the Maghreb, into West Africa. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder documented Hebrew refugees moving into North Africa following the destruction. The Talmud Yerushalmi, the Palestinian Talmud compiled around the 4th century, contains passages describing communities of Israelites who traveled as far west as the edges of the known world. And critically, the Arab geographer al-Makrizi, writing in the early 1400s in his massive historical encyclopedia called Kitat, described communities in West Africa that maintained Hebrew customs, including circumcision practices, dietary laws, and Sabbath observances, that predated the arrival of Islam in the region by centuries. Al-Makrizi wasn't writing a religious tract. He was writing a geographic and historical survey. He was documenting what was there. So when Ibn Khaldun and al-Makrizi, two of the most credentialed historians of the medieval Arab world, both describe Hebrew origin populations in North and West Africa, that deserves serious attention. Here's a question for the comments. Why do you think this part of North African history is almost never included in Western textbooks? Leave your theory below. Now, let's talk about the linguistic evidence, because this is where it gets specific. Scholars of Tamazight, the ancient Berber language spoken across North Africa, have documented for over a century that the language contains a significant layer of ancient Semitic vocabulary that doesn't come from Arabic. It predates the Arab conquest of North Africa in the 7th century. And portions of that vocabulary match ancient Hebrew and Phoenician more closely than they match any other Semitic language. The French linguist and Orientalist Adolphe de Calan, in his 19th century studies of Tamazight, flagged this Semitic substratum as evidence of ancient contact between the Berber populations and Semitic peoples of the Eastern Mediterranean. Contact that would be consistent with migration events from the Levant into North Africa in the centuries surrounding 70 A.D. More recently, the Moroccan historian Mohamed Kabli, writing in his 1986 academic work Société, Pouvoir et Religion au Maroc, documented how Berber social structures, including certain kinship systems and community organization patterns, showed structural parallels to ancient Hebrew tribal systems that had no parallel in the Arab cultures that later dominated the region. The Moors, who entered Spain in 711 A.D., were not a monolithic group. They were a coalition. Arab military commanders led the invasion. That part is documented. But the foot soldiers, the settlers, the agricultural workers, the scholars, and the administrators who built Moorish Spain were overwhelmingly Berber, North African. And according to their own oral histories and lineage records, many of them carried ancestry that traced back far earlier than Islam, far earlier than the Arab world, back to migrations from the East. Let's go deeper into Ibn Khaldun, because this man is not a fringe figure. His work is taught at Oxford, at the Sorbonne, at the University of Chicago. He is considered the father of modern historiography by scholars across the academic world. And in the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun wrote something that has quietly sat in academic libraries for 6.5 centuries without getting nearly enough attention. He wrote that among the Berber peoples of North Africa, there existed groups who claimed direct descent from the ancient Hebrews, specifically from the Israelite tribes who had moved westward across North Africa following the destructions wrought by Babylon and Rome. He listed some of these groups by name. He described their geographic distribution across the Maghreb, and he noted that by his own time, the 1370s, many of these groups had converted to Islam while still maintaining memory of their earlier identity. Ibn Khaldun was skeptical of some of these claims, the way any good historian is skeptical of origin myths. But his skepticism was methodological, not dismissive. He recorded them because they were there, because the communities he was documenting believed them, and because some of the structural and cultural evidence he observed was consistent with them. Al-Makrizi goes even further. In his Khitat, his encyclopedic survey of Egypt and surrounding regions, Al-Makrizi documented what he described as communities in the Sahel, the band of territory between Sahara and the sub-Saharan forests, who had been there before Islam, before Christianity, and who maintained practices that he identified as consistent with ancient Hebrew law. He described populations in what is now Mali, Senegal, and Niger, who observed a Sabbath day of rest, who practiced circumcision, who maintained food prohibitions that he recognized as Mosaic in origin, and who told genealogical stories of coming from the east, from across the great desert, from a homeland that had been destroyed by a great empire. This is not mythology. This is a 13th and 15th century Arab historian documenting what he observed and was told by people who were actually there. Now, here's the question that should be making your brain work right now. If this was known to Arab historians in the 1300s and 1400s, who else had access to these records? Hold that question, because we're about to get to Christopher Columbus. October 3rd, 1492. Columbus is 11 days from land he doesn't yet know exists, and he is writing in his diary. The Diary of Christopher Columbus, formerly known as the Diario de a Bordo, exists today only in a summarized form, compiled by the Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas in the early 16th century. The original was lost, but Las Casas worked directly from Columbus's own manuscript and in many places copied it word for word, flagging when he was paraphrasing versus quoting directly. And in those pages, Columbus revealed something that historians have discussed but rarely emphasized to a general audience. Columbus was not just looking for a trade route to Asia, he was looking for people, specific people, and he had a specific framework for who he expected to find. In multiple entries from the 1492 diary, as preserved in Las Casas, Columbus makes references to the 10 lost tribes of Israel. He references the Hebrew scripture and the prophetic tradition of a scattered people being found in the far reaches of the earth. He had read the works of the medieval Jewish scholar and royal advisor Isaac Abravanel, who published in 1492, the same year as the voyage, a commentary on the Hebrew prophets, arguing that the lost tribes of Israel were to be found in lands far to the west. Think about that timing. Isaac Abravanel published his commentary predicting westward-dwelling Israelites in the same year Columbus sailed west. Abravanel was not a fringe figure. He was the treasurer of the Spanish crown until the expulsion decree that same year. Columbus corresponded with scholars in his era. He had access to the maps and geographic theories circulating among educated Europeans and converso Jews, Jewish people who had converted to Christianity and often maintained connections to Hebrew scholarship. And the theory that a lost Israelite civilization existed somewhere beyond the Western Ocean was not obscure. It was actively debated in intellectual circles Columbus moved in. Now here is where it gets even directer. In his diary entries from the Caribbean in late 1492, Columbus repeatedly notes his surprise and interest when he observes practices among the indigenous people he encounters that he interprets as consistent with Hebrew customs. He notes dietary practices. He notes what he interprets as circumcision in some communities. He comments on linguistic sounds that he tries to connect to Hebrew roots. Now, Columbus was not a trained linguist or anthropologist. His interpretations may have been wrong. That's not the point. The point is what the interpretations reveal about what he was looking for. You don't notice things unless you're looking for them. Columbus was looking for Israelites. That's what his diary shows. Is Columbus right? Was the man a reliable narrator? Drop your take in the comments. This is exactly the kind of thing people need to argue about. Now, let's bring in a second physical document, the Piri Reis map of 1513. Piri Reis was an Ottoman admiral and cartographer. In 1513, just 21 years after Columbus's first voyage, he drew a map of the Atlantic world that included the coastlines of South America and what appears to be an outline of Antarctica, which was not officially discovered until 1820. How did Piri Reis know? In his own notations on the map, which survive, he wrote that he compiled his map from multiple source maps, including maps that had been captured from Spanish sailors, and including, he claims, maps that Columbus himself had used. Piri Reis wrote explicitly that Columbus had sailed with maps that predated 1492, maps that showed land to the west of Africa. Which means Columbus wasn't discovering something unknown. He was going somewhere that was already on a map that someone at some point had made, which means someone had already been there or someone already knew the land existed. Who made those prior maps? That question does not have a clean answer, but here is a piece of physical evidence that sits in a completely different part of the world and adds a layer to this story that is very hard to explain away. The Olmec heads of Mexico. 17 massive stone heads, some weighing up to 50 tons, were carved by the Olmec civilization of Mesoamerica roughly 1500 BC and 400 BC. They predate Columbus by more than 1,000 years, and their facial features, documented by archaeologists, argued over in peer-reviewed journals since at least the 1940s, have been described by multiple researchers as displaying features consistent with West African populations, not the features typically associated with the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica. The anthropologist Andrzej Wiercinski presented a formal paper at the 1975 International Congress of Americanists, arguing that skeletal remains found at Olmec sites showed African morphological characteristics. The scholar Ivan van Sertima, in his 1976 book, They Came Before Columbus, published by Random House, made the historical and archaeological case that West African seafarers made contact with Mesoamerica before the European age of exploration. Van Sertima's work is controversial in academic circles, but it is not dismissed. It is debated. And debate in archaeology means the evidence is real enough to argue about. So put these pieces together. Columbus had maps suggesting prior knowledge of Western lands. Piri Reis confirms those maps existed, and physical monuments in Mexico suggest African presence in the Americas 1,000 years before Columbus set foot there. The question is not whether Columbus discovered America. We've known for decades that he didn't. The question is what he was actually looking for when he got there. January 2, 1492, Granada falls. The last Moorish kingdom in Iberia surrenders to Isabella and Ferdinand. 700 years of Moorish civilization on European soil comes to an end. March 31, 1492. The Alhambra Decree is signed. Every Jewish person in Spain is given 4 months to convert to Christianity or leave. 200,000 people, some estimates say more, are expelled from the country many of their families had lived in for generations. August 3, 1492, Columbus sets sail from Palos de la Frontera. His fleet of 3 ships leaves Spanish waters, headed west. 3 events, one year, one queen, one policy framework. Now here is what makes this more than coincidence. The expulsion of the Moors and the expulsion of the Jews were not separate operations. They were part of the same project, a project historians call the Spanish Reconquista and the subsequent Inquisition, aimed at creating a religiously unified Spanish state under Catholic authority. But here's the layer that almost never gets discussed in American classrooms. The Sephardic Jews being expelled from Spain in 1492 had lived in the Iberian Peninsula for over 1,000 years. They had been there before the Moors arrived. They had coexisted with the Moorish civilization. They had served in Moorish courts. They had collaborated with Moorish scholars. And they shared something with the Moors that they shared with almost no one else in Europe, a memory of the ancient Levant, a cultural and in many cases genealogical connection to the ancient Near East. The Spanish crown was not just expelling two groups of people, it was expelling two populations that, by the account of the Arab historians we've already discussed, shared a common origin point in the ancient Israelite world. And at the same time, the exact same time, they dispatched Columbus westward. The historian Cecil Roth, in his scholarly work A History of the Marranos, published in 1932, documented extensively that several of Columbus's crew members were conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, who were fleeing the Inquisition's scrutiny. Roth and subsequent historians, including Simon Wiesenthal, who wrote Sails of Hope in 1973, argued that Columbus himself may have had converso ancestry. If Columbus was looking for the lost tribes, and if the people being expelled from Spain at that exact moment were connected to those same lost tribes, then the 1492 triple event is not three separate historical occurrences. It is one coordinated operation playing out on three simultaneous tracks. Expel the people from Spain, document the New World, and go find the ones who got away. That's a theory. I want to be clear, it's a theory grounded in documented evidence, not proven historical fact. But the documented evidence for it is stronger than most people realize. What do you think the real motive behind Columbus's voyage was? Spices, gold, or something else? Put it in the comments, because this debate matters. When the Moors were expelled from Spain, they didn't disappear. You can't expel 700 years of civilization and have it simply evaporate. The documentation of where they went is, in broad strokes, well established. Many went to North Africa, to Morocco, to Tunisia, to the Ottoman Empire. Some integrated into Arab and Berber communities that were already there. Some maintained distinct Moorish identity for generations. But here is the piece of this story that connects to everything we've covered today. A significant portion of the expelled Moorish population, particularly the lower status agricultural and trade communities who couldn't afford passage to the major Ottoman or North African cities, moved south, deeper into West Africa, into the Sahel, into the river valley civilizations of the Niger and Senegal regions. They moved, in other words, into the exact territory that the Arab historians Ibn Khaldun and El-Makrizi had documented as home to Hebrew-origin populations a century and 2 centuries earlier. They went back to where their people had already been. And then, within roughly a century, the transatlantic slave trade reached those regions: the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British. The same European power structure that had expelled the Moors from Spain and sent Columbus westward now sent slave ships to the west coast of Africa, the Senegambia region, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast, the Congo Basin, the exact territories where the descendants of the Moorish expulsion had settled, where, before them, the Arab historians had documented Hebrew-origin populations living for centuries. The line runs from Roman destruction, westward migration, North African settlement, Moorish Spain, expulsion, deeper West Africa, slave ships. That is a documented sequence of population movements that stretches from the ancient world to the modern one. Ibn Khaldun, 1377, the Muqaddimah, documents Berber tribal groups tracing Hebrew ancestry in North Africa. Al-Makrizi, early 1400s, the Khitat, documents Hebrew practicing communities in West Africa predating Islam. Columbus Diary, 1492, preserved by Bartolomé de las Casas, shows Columbus explicitly referencing the lost tribes of Israel as a framework for his voyage. Isaac Abravanel, 1492, publishes Hebrew prophetic commentary locating the lost tribes in lands to the west, the same year Columbus sailed west. P.D. Rees map, 1513, Ottoman admiral documents that Columbus sailed with pre-existing maps showing western lands, implying prior knowledge of what he would find. Olmec Eds, 1500 BC to 400 BC, documented by archaeologists including Andrzej Wiercinski and scholars including Ivan van Sertima. Physical monuments in Mexico displaying facial features debated as West African in origin. The 1492 triple event, Moorish expulsion, Jewish expulsion, Columbus's departure, all under Isabella's authority, all in the same year. Cecil Roth, 1932, A History of the Marranos, documents Converso crew members on Columbus's ships. Simon Wiesenthal, 1973, Sails of Hope, argues Columbus's voyage was connected to the fate of expelled Jewish communities. Post-1492 Moorish migration into West Africa, documented in Portuguese colonial records, Arabic chronicles, and oral histories of the Sahel region. None of these sources are anonymous. None of them are internet rumors. They are named documents by named historians with verifiable publication histories. The question is not whether this evidence exists, it does. The question is what you make of it when you put it all together. 7 centuries. The Moors held one of the most sophisticated civilizations the Western world had ever produced for 7 centuries. They built the Library of Córdoba, which at its height held 400,000 manuscripts, when most European royal libraries held a few hundred. They built the Alhambra Palace in Granada, which architects and engineers still study today. They introduced Europe to algebra, to surgical instruments, to systems of paper currency, to the philosophical works of ancient Greece that Europe itself had lost and had to get back through Arabic translation. And then, in 1 year, 1492, it was over. The same year Columbus left, the same year the Jews were expelled, the same year the Spanish crown completed its unification under Catholic authority. And Columbus, sailing west, writing in his diary, referencing the lost tribes of Israel, arriving in a new world with maps that someone had already made, was looking for people who the Arab historians of his era had already documented in West Africa. Whether Columbus found what he was looking for is a separate question. Whether he was right about who the people he encountered actually were is a separate question. But what his diary shows is that he was looking. He had a target, and the target was not spices. His receipt is the receipt, and the receipt has been sitting in Spanish archives since the 16th century. Here's what I want you to think about after this video ends. 3 events in 1 year. An Ottoman admiral with maps Columbus used. Stone heads in Mexico 1,000 years before Columbus. Arab historians documenting Hebrew communities in West Africa. A Moorish civilization expelled from Europe and moving south into the same regions that would become the heart of the slave trade a century later. Is this the full story? No, History's never the full story on a single video. There are counter-arguments, missing links, gaps in the record that honest scholars acknowledge. But is there enough documented evidence here to demand a serious conversation in schools, in universities, in documentaries, in the public square about who the Moors actually were and what Columbus actually knew? Absolutely, without question, yes. The evidence is in the archives. The names are on the documents. The dates are recorded. All that's missing is the conversation. If you believe Columbus knew exactly who he was looking for when he sailed in 1492, drop the word diary in the comments right now. And if this is the first time you're hearing any of this, tell me what surprised you most. Was it the Ibn Khaldun documentation, the Piri Rice map, the 1492 triple event, or something else? Because the comments on this video are about to be a serious history seminar. Share this with someone who thinks they know the full story of Columbus, because they don't, not yet.